I don't mean to move it in a different iteration. I had a bullet point next to where you spoke about rents and the difference between rents and income from actually working. If you can kind of go into that and just kind of just give a brief broadside of that, what it means
Sure.
to individual people.
Sure. This is an issue in the history of economics, of political economy, that goes back to the 18th and 19th centuries. Rent is the part of your income that comes simply from owning land or some other physical asset, and earning it doesn't require that you actually do anything. So this was associated is associated with being a landlord or being a proprietor of a terrain of some kind, and the lesson of classical political economy was that since that the recipients of rent didn't really have to do anything in order to earn it, they were basically earning the productivity of the land that they owned by the conveyance of a legal title, that they should be the ones who are taxed. And that taxes should not fall on labor. They should not fall on capital, which is necessary for productive purposes, but they should fall on land, and that was the appropriate place from which to draw resources for public purposes. So that's the basic lesson of classical taxation theory. I think it's a very sound theory. I think it's extremely interesting that in one major country in the world, which is China, where the government holds practically all of the land, certainly the very large majority of it even now, the cities are very well funded. And the reason they're well funded is they collect rent. So they don't have to have sales taxes. They don't have to have income taxes to any significant extent. It's very hard to do in the chaotic Chinese economy, but they can simply say, well, you want to use this factory, this office building, here's your rent, and you can pay it or go someplace else. And of course, for high-value properties, people pay a lot. So that's how Shanghai finances itself, and that's why if you go there, you will see that the infrastructure has expanded out to an extent which is just extraordinary to the eyes of anybody coming from North America or Europe. So it does work as a model, and it is a sensible way to proceed to try and place the burden of taxation on that fixed asset land. Instead, what we're doing, and what the Europeans are doing, is taxing sales, value-added taxes, which is cumbersome and extremely regressive. In the U.S., we have a very complex structure of taxes, but we specifically minimize the taxes on land because of the extraordinary influence of landowners in the making of these laws. Texas, for example, has a constitutional ban on a property tax at the state level. Why is that the case? Well, the Texas Constitution was written by property owners. It's not a surprise.
That is actually incredible. I didn't actually know that about Texas, even though I live here.
Yeah, and it's not the only state. I don't have a full list, but there's certainly common practice.
I guess so. You said something else, a value added. Our taxes added on. You said value added. There seem to be more value added tax. Could you explain to generally what they mean by that, like a value added tax?
A value added tax is just a layered tax on sales, and it's administered in a slightly different way from a final sales tax, which we're familiar with in this country. But it's a very effective way to raise revenue. Because it's harder to evade than a final sales tax. But it is a very regressive tax, and one which is a huge burden on paying on the consumer. European consumers are typically paying 20 to, in the case of Greece, 24% on top of the price of practically anything they buy.
And that basically follows the mode of, in America, it seems like a lot of the tax burden is always placed on consumption. Like, maybe not always, but it seems like that's where it's been shifting over time. I don't know if that's, a side effect of multiple people, acting in different concerts. That's just an overall general effect of people wanting to push the tax burden onto consumption and how regressive that is, as opposed to how progressive, taxing, basically rents would be.
Yeah, I mean, we're somewhere in the middle in the United States. We have a pretty effective income tax, which is, for all of its flaws and problems and complexity, most of the American public is familiar with it, cooperates with it, so that it's possible for the U.S. federal government, anyway, to base itself on a at least substantially progressive tax base. Better than Europe, but not so good as if you really focused on taxing land.
So that's actually strange because everybody has this preconceived notion when they come in, including myself, and I figured that the tax structure, for the most part, was highly unfair. But you're saying it does okay, for all its flaws.
Well, let's say I think that the income tax is, in fact, a remarkable American institution. The payroll tax is regressive. Sales taxes at the local level are regressive. And you have a problem in our country of the very decentralized structure. You have a lot of poorer towns that are, in fact, don't have the tax base either of incomes or, for that matter, sales. And so what do? They pile parking tickets on poor people. They do things of this kind. This was, in fact, one of the sources of the upheaval in Ferguson, Missouri, a year ago. Was a large part of the population was regarded the police correctly as an institution which was there to slap citations on them in order to raise revenue for the town. And that kind of that is sort of fundamentally unjust, fundamentally a very bad way to govern a city, and is likely to produce a huge, and does produce a huge amount of well-justified resentment.
I think you hit a huge bell right there when, a lot of times people talk about economic decisions and kind of how it affects their lives. I think that's, first off, I think it's everywhere and it affects your life almost in everything that you do. But, a tangible result like that, where you say the police are basically seen as, instead of a public service, they're seen as some sort of revenue engine to provide the city with needed revenue rather than, figuring out a way to solve their problems in another way, or maybe having support from the state or the county or something else. But that they're seen as basically a way to raise revenue, and it shouldn't be like that. And like you just said, it's a poor way to govern.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. And of course, it's obviously very unfair to police officers as well, because they generally consider their job to be public safety, and if they're being pressured to harass people, this is not helpful.